Hi, this is Ms. Delosier, and these are your notes on life and homeostasis. So part of this is going to be big time review, and then part of it is going to go a little deeper than you've probably gone in the past. So we're going to go over the basic characteristics of life. This is a longer list than you've probably seen for the characteristics of life before, but they're pretty obvious when you think about them. So living things move. So they're capable of changing their body position, but that means also that there can be internal movement. So when I swallow, my esophagus contracts and it pushes water or food down through my body, and that causes internal movement. Responsiveness is just your body reacts to a stimulus. So if you stub your toe, it hurts, right? If a mosquito lands on your arm, you can feel the mosquito. If somebody waves at you or calls your name, you can react to that stimulus. So that's responsiveness. Growth describes an increase in body size without a change in the overall shape of the body. So like your body can go ahead and increase in height when you're young. Reproduction can be making a whole new organism, but it also just means production of new cells. So if you cut yourself and your body goes ahead and repairs that cut by forming new cells, that's reproduction of cells. And then respiration. So respiration is the exchange in most organisms. Ooh, I didn't make those twos into subscripts. I'm sorry. That should be O little 2 and CO little 2. Exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide. In most organisms, you bring in oxygen. Most animals, you bring in oxygen and then you produce carbon dioxide as a byproduct. However, not all organisms actually require oxygen, but humans do. And this is human anatomy and physiology, so we're going to go with it. And then they use that oxygen to go ahead and metabolize or break down food to release energy. So again, I take the oxygen, I combine it with glucose, I can go ahead and do that whole cellular respiration thing to release ATP. For those of you that have forgotten, since 9th grade biology, metabolism is the chemical reactions that support life. Also, living things digest. Animals digest or break down food. Again, plants don't. So they're not going to meet this. But we're studying human biology. So they have the breaking down of food. And you also have absorption of the substances that were in that food through the membranes in body fluids. And it doesn't have to be food substances. But absorption just means basically you have substances in the body. I need to get them through a membrane into a body fluid and then carry them someplace. That's absorption. Circulation is just movement of body fluids. We know that. Assimilation, not like the Borg. Assimilation is when you take the substances that have been absorbed through those membranes. So let's say I'm going to take some protein molecules and I'm going to convert them into a new protein. Or let's say that I take some sugar molecules and I break it down and then I'm going to build something new out of that in a metabolic process. And then excretion is just removal of waste. So those are the basic characteristics of life. Life is supposed to do all, if not most, if not all. You're supposed to do most of those things to be considered alive. But obviously there's certain ones that are kind of iffy, and this is very much targeted towards humans. So let's talk about how we maintain life. So life requires or depends on 5 specific environmental factors. 1, water. So water is the most abundant substance from a molecular compound standpoint on the planet. It is also the most abundant substance in your body, and it forms the environment for all metabolic processes. Like everything that happens in your cells, everything that happens in your interstitial fluid, it's all in an environment that is mostly water. And so it's basically required for your metabolic processes to happen. It is also required to transport things through the body. And we use water to regulate body temperature. And we'll talk about that when we study your integumentary system. Food, I've lost my bullets. Food provides the necessary nutrients that you need and is going to ultimately supply you with energy and the raw materials for building new tissues and new cells. Then the next ones are oxygen, heat, and pressure. And oxygen is a pretty obvious one. So oxygen is 20% of the air that you breathe, and you require oxygen to go ahead and conduct cellular respiration. So it's needed to release energy from the food that you consume. If you don't have oxygen, you can't get any energy from the food that you're eating, so there's no point in eating, and you'll die. So heat is how we maintain body temperature, and heat controls the rate of metabolic reaction to some extent. If you think back to your chemistry, depending on the heat of a substance, it controlled how fast chemicals reacted together. But heat is more complicated than that because you maintain a constant, you're supposed to maintain a constant internal body temperature. And so that heat is required, but you generate that heat as a byproduct of your metabolic reactions also. So we'll talk about that when we get into cellular processes. And then pressure. So pressure is the application of force on an object. So if anyone's ever stepped on your foot, that is pressure. But we're going to be talking primarily about atmospheric pressure, which is important for actually inflating and compressing, exhaling and inhaling, so your lungs. And then hydrostatic pressure, which is responsible for keeping your blood flowing. So obviously that's important. So now we're going to talk about homeostasis. So I know you all know the word homeostasis. Homeostasis is just the maintenance of a stable internal environment. So, your internal environment is supposed to be 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit or 37 degrees Celsius. So that is your homeostatic set point for temperature. But homeostasis is not just temperature. It's all of the conditions in your body. And so when we're talking about homeostatic mechanisms, we're talking about self-regulating systems that monitor all aspects of your internal environment and then correct them as needed. So like if I get a little too hot because it's August and I'm outside in Texas, I need to correct that and lower my body temperature. So what do? I start sweating, and that's going to go ahead, and the evaporative cooling will help me lower my body temperature. There's 3 parts of a homeostatic mechanism, and they're required to go ahead and make the cycle or the feedback loop work. And that is the receptor, which is going to detect the stimulus. In this case, it's too hot. The control center, which is the decision maker that maintains the set point. You can think of that as the brain. Most of the time it will be. It's not always the brain. A lot of times it's just the gland or a gland. And then the effector, which is a muscle or gland that's going to respond and changes and causes the change. So let's look at a generic homeostatic mechanism. So if we go over here onto the left, right here, we've got a stimulus. So something happens in my internal environment and it's going to trigger a receptor. And then that's going to go ahead and be relayed to the control center. And that's going to compare it to the set point. So I'm going to see, hey, did it get too hot? Did it get too cold? Like, what's my set point at? Or am I just the same? And then based on that comparison, it's going to send a signal to the effector, so a muscle or a gland, and then that's going to cause a response to correct whatever needs to be corrected depending on what our stimulus was. This is super generic, so we're going to look at a more specific one. So let's look at a more specific one. I know this is small. It's in your textbook. Sorry. Hopefully you can zoom in really big on your iPad. So let's go ahead and let's start here at the middle of the figure 8. And we're only going to follow one path because it's too complicated. So let's say that my body temperature is too hot because that's the one we already started talking about. So I'm going to follow this path. My stimulus is that my body temperature is too hot. And then I'm going to go ahead and the receptor is going to be thermoreceptors, and they're going to send a signal to the control center. And in this case, the control center is the hypothalamus. And the hypothalamus is going to detect a deviation, a change from my normal body temperature, and it's going to send a signal to the effectors. In this case, the effectors are the blood vessels in your skin, right? And they're going to cause your skin blood vessels to dilate to get like to swell up, to actually get a little fatter, larger in diameter. And that's going to increase the amount of blood that flows through those blood vessels because they're kind of a larger diameter. And that is going to allow for more blood to be carried through my skin and allow for a greater rate of sweat and gland secretion, which will go ahead and produce sweat on your skin, right? Which will evaporate, leading to evaporative cooling. So body heat's lost to the surroundings, lowering my body heat back, right? And that is an example of a feedback loop. I could go the other way, go ahead and go the other way, and instead of actually sending a blood vessel to get bigger, it's going to contract, and that's going to cause you to pull that blood back towards your core because you don't need to waste that heat. It also causes some shivering, but we'll talk about that later. So negative feedback. There's two types of feedback loops, negative feedback loops and positive feedback loops. Here's what you need to remember. Almost all loops in the human body and in most of biology are going to be negative feedback loops. There are examples of positive feedback loops. When we talk about them, I'll be like, hey, this one's weird because it's a positive feedback loop. So in a negative feedback loop, your effector is going to return the conditions towards the normal range, and the deviation from the set point lessens. So what does that mean? Here's what it means. Let's say my body temperature gets too hot. I need to go ahead and send a message to my effector to go ahead and go back, to decrease that, to go back in the opposite. My body temperature was going up. I want my body temperature to go down. And then what's going to happen is it's going to stop the loop. So that's a negative feedback loop. So it's a negative feedback loop because it's going to move the variable, temperature in this case, in the opposite direction of that it was going, right? And so it prevents sudden severe changes in the body. So examples are like body temperature, because we've already talked about that one a lot, but also blood pressure, glucose levels. If your carbon dioxide levels get too high in your blood, it causes a change in the acidity of your blood, and that also triggers a negative feedback loop. Positive feedback loops are super uncommon in the body. In a positive feedback loop, the change, the increase or the decrease, is actually going to be amplified or intensified instead of reversed. So the activity of the effector actually is increased. And these are short-lived. And they're going to produce unstable body conditions, because if you think about it, my feedback loop is triggered because something was too high, and then I'm going to go ahead and make it higher, and then higher, and then higher. And eventually, if that doesn't stop, it would cause enough of a severe homeostatic imbalance that your body would be unable to recover. So these produce unstable conditions that seem like they're not going to lead to homeostasis, but they will, because you only see positive feedback loops in examples where the body needs to take drastic measures, like if you cut yourself and you need to clot that blood. So it's going to continually go ahead and send those clotting factors until the bleeding stops. Or it causes increased uterine contractions during childbirth until there's no baby to actually cause that pressure increase anymore, and then the contractions stop. So those are positive feedback loops. And we can talk more about those in tutorials, and I can kind of break them down a little bit more with some specific examples if you're struggling with them, but I'm also going to probably provide you with a crash course video on those. So that's it for life and homeostasis. I know that was a long set of notes. I'm sorry. I don't know what to tell you. There was a lot. So I will see you tomorrow.